Naomi, a successful black doctor, was expecting a regular trip to work when the bus pulled up to the stop, but it didn't go the way she expected. The driver, upon seeing her, abruptly refused to let her into the cabin, despite her protests. She tried to explain that she had the right to travel, but his rudeness turned into something more. Suddenly, right on the street, he attacks her, brutally knocking her down. Passers-by watched, but no one intervened. What happened next left a mark on her whole life. Do not forget to subscribe to the channel and write in the comments from where you are watching this video. The cool morning air bit into Naomi's skin as she stood at the bus stop, her breath coming out in visible puffs. She wrapped her coat tighter around herself, eyes scanning the street for any sign of the approaching bus. The streets bustled with early commuters, the sound of car engines and hurried footsteps echoing through the city. Today was just another ordinary day, or so Naomi thought. As a successful doctor, Naomi had faced more than her share of challenges, but few compared to the daily grind of enduring casual racism in the streets, at work, and sometimes even in her own community. She had long grown used to the microaggressions, the subtle sneers, and the side comments about her ability to succeed in a field dominated by people who didn't look like her. It never got easier, but Naomi had developed a tough exterior over the years. Thick skin, as her mother called it. But this morning, something felt different. She was exhausted, emotionally drained from her long shifts at the hospital, where she saved lives, but often received little gratitude. It was another long day ahead, and Naomi just wanted to get through it. Finally, the bus came into view, its large frame gliding toward the stop. Naomi stepped forward with a slight sense of relief. At least the bus was on time today. As it pulled up and the doors hissed open, Naomi adjusted her bag on her shoulder, ready to step aboard. But something stopped her. The driver, a white man with graying hair and a hardened expression, didn't look at her with the usual detachment of a public servant just trying to get through the day. No, this look was different. His eyes scanned her from head to toe, his expression one of disdain, as if her presence offended him somehow. For a brief moment, Naomi thought she must be imagining it. It had been a long week, and her mind was playing tricks on her. But then, he spoke. "Not today," the driver muttered, his voice low but filled with unmistakable contempt. Naomi blinked, unsure if she'd heard him correctly. The passengers already inside the bus turned their heads slightly, curious but uninterested, waiting for the bus to move on. Naomi forced a polite smile, stepping closer to the open doors. "Excuse me," she asked, her voice calm but firm. "I need to get to work." The driver didn't move. His hand gripped the steering wheel as he leaned forward, locking eyes with her. "I said, not today," he repeated, louder this time, his tone dripping with hostility. Naomi's heart skipped a beat, a familiar but unwelcome feeling of dread creeping into her chest. She had faced discrimination before, but never so blatantly, never so directly in front of a crowd. She glanced at the other passengers, their faces indifferent, some even turning away as if they didn't want to witness the confrontation. "I'm not sure what you mean," Naomi said, her voice rising slightly. "I have a ticket. I just need to get on the bus." The driver's lip curled in a sneer. "Take the next one," he snapped, his eyes narrowing with disgust. "You're not getting on this bus." For a moment, Naomi was frozen. Her mind raced as she processed the absurdity of the situation. Was he really refusing her service because of her race? The raw sting of humiliation hit her like a slap to the face. She had worked hard to become a respected doctor, to build a life for herself where she could hold her head high. But in this moment, none of that mattered. To this man, she was nothing more than her skin color, a problem to be ignored, dismissed, and rejected. Her anger bubbled up, but she kept her composure. She couldn't let this man get the better of her. She had faced too many challenges in life to be taken down by one racist bus driver. "I have every right to be on this bus," Naomi said, her voice steady but firm, stepping closer to the doors. "You can't refuse me service because of—" Before she could finish her sentence, the driver shot up from his seat, slamming the doors shut with a force that rattled the entire bus. He stormed toward her, his face twisted with rage. The sudden movement caught Naomi off guard, and she stumbled back as he approached. "I told you," he growled, jabbing a finger toward her face. "You're not getting on this bus." "Now get out of here, before I make you." Naomi's breath hitched. The aggression in his voice, the hatred in his eyes, it was unmistakable. She glanced around, hoping for someone, anyone to intervene. But the other passengers simply sat there, their faces blank, their gazes averted. No one moved, no one spoke. They were content to let this happen, content to watch her, be humiliated, beaten down by racism in broad daylight. The bus driver stepped even closer, invading her space with the stench of cigarette smoke and anger. "You people think you can do whatever you want, don't you?" he snarled. "Well, not today." Naomi's heart pounded in her chest. She wanted to fight back, to scream, to push him away. But the shock of the situation paralyzed her. This wasn't just an argument anymore. This was a full-on attack. Without warning, the driver shoved her violently, sending Naomi sprawling onto the cold, hard pavement. She hit the ground with a thud, pain shooting through her knees as she scraped them against the concrete. She tried to catch herself, but before she could fully recover, the driver was on her again. He kicked her once, then again, the blows landing hard and fast. "Get out of here," he roared, his voice filled with a sickening rage. "You don't belong here." Naomi gasped for breath. Her body crumpled on the sidewalk, the pain searing through her limbs. She could barely process what was happening. How had this escalated so quickly? Her vision blurred with tears of pain and frustration as she struggled to get up. But the driver kicked her again, sending her crashing back to the ground. The people on the bus watched in silence. Some even pulled out their phones, recording the incident. But no one moved to help. Naomi could hear their murmurs, their whispers, but no one made a sound that mattered. The weight of their indifference crushed her spirit even more than the driver's fists. The world around her seemed to move in slow motion. The driver, breathing heavily, stood over her like a predator, his fists still clenched, his face red with fury. Naomi lay on the pavement, broken and defeated, her body aching from the assault. For a moment, the driver paused, catching his breath. He looked around, as if realizing the scene he had caused. He spit on the ground next to her, a final act of degradation, before storming back onto the bus. "I told you to stay down," he spat, slamming the door shut behind him. The bus roared back to life, pulling away from the curb, leaving Naomi lying there, alone and in pain. The cold seeped into her bones as she lay there on the sidewalk, staring up at the gray sky. Tears slipped down her cheeks, not from the physical pain, but from the humiliation, the helplessness. She had fought her whole life to prove herself, to be more than just a statistic, and yet, here she was, reduced to nothing by a man who saw her as less than human. The bus disappeared into the distance, taking with it the passengers who had witnessed the whole thing but done nothing to stop it. Naomi lay there, her body aching, her heart heavy with the weight of a world that still refused to see her for who she was. Slowly, painfully, she pushed herself up, her legs trembling beneath her. She had to keep going. She couldn't let this defeat her. But as she stood there, battered and bruised, she knew that this moment would stay with her forever, a painful reminder of the cruel reality of the world she lived in. Naomi stood frozen on the sidewalk, her knees scraped raw, and blood trickling down her leg. Her body ached from the impact of the fall, but worse than the physical pain was the deep sting of humiliation and disbelief. She clutched her bag tightly to her chest, as if it could somehow shield her from the overwhelming reality of what had just happened. The bus driver had attacked her, publicly, without hesitation, and left her lying on the ground like she was nothing. People saw it, everyone saw it, but no one moved to help. As the bus drove off, the distant hum of the engine fading into the morning bustle, Naomi slowly pushed herself to her feet. Her legs wobbled beneath her, and she had to steady herself on a nearby lamppost. The pain radiating from her ribs made it hard to breathe. Each inhale a struggle. She winced as she stood, every movement sending waves of discomfort through her body. Around her, the streets continued to buzz with life. Pedestrians hurried by, their faces averted, deliberately avoiding eye contact. A few glanced at her, but quickly turned away as if pretending they hadn't seen anything. Some people still lingered near the bus stop, staring at her, their phones raised, capturing the aftermath. Naomi's heart sank as she realized what was happening. They weren't going to help her. They were watching her humiliation, recording it, but none of them would step in or even ask if she was okay. Her chest tightened with a mixture of anger and helplessness. Was this it? Was this all she was worth to them? Just another bystander moment to share on social media. Another example of racism that people would talk about for a day before moving on. Naomi tried to calm her racing thoughts, but before she could collect herself, she heard the sound of police sirens in the distance. Her stomach dropped. The driver had called the police. She could feel it in her gut, the way he had strutted back onto the bus, the self-righteousness in his eyes. He was going to twist the story, and no one would be here to defend her. Fear crept into her mind as the sirens grew louder, their piercing wail cutting through the chaos of the street. Moments later, 2 police cars screeched to a halt at the curb. The officers stepped out, their faces set in unreadable expressions as they surveyed the scene. Naomi's heart pounded in her chest. She wanted to explain, to shout the truth, but a sinking feeling told her that it wouldn't matter. The driver had already framed the narrative, and she knew from years of experience that the truth didn't always count when you were black. The bus driver, who had by now circled back to meet the police, immediately launched into his fabricated version of the events. "She came at me," he spat, his voice dripping with venom, started shouting, wouldn't pay her fare, and then she attacked me. I had no choice but to defend myself. Naomi's mouth fell open in shock. The audacity of his lie hit her like a punch to the gut. She could barely believe what she was hearing. She took a step forward, her voice shaking with a mixture of anger and desperation. "That's not true." He refused to let me on the bus, and then he attacked me. One of the officers, a tall man with a stern face, glanced at Naomi before turning his attention back to the bus driver. "You're saying she attacked you first?" he asked, his tone flat, almost bored, as if this were just another routine incident. The driver nodded vigorously. "Yeah, she was aggressive from the start. I told her to take the next bus, and she just lost it." Naomi could feel her blood boiling. How could he stand there and lie so effortlessly? She looked at the officers, hoping, begging, that they would see the truth in her eyes, but they didn't. Instead, the officer who had been speaking turned back to her, his expression cold and unsympathetic. "Ma'am, step away from him," he ordered, his hand resting on the baton at his hip. "I didn't do anything," Naomi said, her voice shaking with disbelief. "He attacked me. He refused to let me on the bus, and when I tried to defend myself—" "Ma'am, I said step away," the officer repeated, cutting her off. His voice was firm now, and Naomi could feel the situation slipping further out of her control. "I'm the one who was attacked," Naomi shouted, her frustration finally boiling over. She raised her hands in desperation, trying to explain, but the officers weren't listening. The second officer, who had been silent up until now, stepped forward. "We'll sort this out at the station," he said curtly, before grabbing Naomi's arm and pulling her toward the police car. "No," Naomi protested, trying to pull away, but the officer's grip tightened. "You don't understand. I didn't do anything wrong." Her words fell on deaf ears. The officer pushed her roughly into the back of the car, his hand gripping her wrist with unnecessary force as he forced her inside. Naomi winced as the cuffs dug into her already bruised skin, her body still aching from the assault. She felt the cold metal of the handcuffs biting into her wrists, each movement a painful reminder of how powerless she was in this moment. From inside the car, Naomi could see the bus driver smirking, his expression one of satisfaction. He had gotten exactly what he wanted. The police had believed him without question, without even considering her side of the story. And now she was the one being arrested, her reputation, her dignity, shattered in an instant. The police car pulled away from the curb, and as it did, Naomi watched the bystanders fade into the distance, their faces still indifferent. No one had stepped in. No one had tried to stop what was happening. The weight of their silence pressed down on her, suffocating her spirit. She had been reduced to a victim in front of everyone, and they had done nothing. The ride to the station was silent, except for the occasional crackle of the police radio. Naomi sat in the back seat, her mind racing, trying to process what had just happened. It was like a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. How had everything gone so wrong? She was a doctor, someone who dedicated her life to helping others, and yet here she was, treated like a criminal. her cries for justice ignored. As they arrived at the station, the officers pulled her out of the car, their grip still rough and unyielding. Naomi stumbled as they led her inside, her body weak from the day's events. They didn't bother to listen to her protests as they pushed her into a holding cell, the door slamming shut behind her. With a final, deafening clang, Naomi collapsed onto the cold metal bench, her wrists still bound, her body trembling from the shock of it all. How had this happened? How had she gone from a respected doctor to a prisoner in a matter of minutes? Tears welled up in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She couldn't break down. Not here, not now. But the sense of betrayal, of helplessness, gnawed at her insides. The driver had gotten away with it, and she had been left to pay the price for his lies. In the dark, cold cell, Naomi sat in silence, the weight of the world pressing down on her. She had never felt so alone. Naomi sat in the back of the courtroom, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, her heart pounding in her chest. The walls seemed to close in on her, the sterile air thick with anticipation. It was supposed to be a place where justice was served, where the truth was uncovered. But today, it felt more like a stage set for another crushing defeat. She had walked into this room with hope, despite everything, but that hope was slowly unraveling before her eyes. The day after her arrest, the pain from the attack still fresh on her body, Naomi had filed charges against the bus driver. She couldn't let him get away with what he had done. The thought of him walking free, smug and confident in his lies, was too much to bear. She had always believed in the justice system, had trusted that the truth would come to light and the wrongs would be righted. After all, she was a doctor, someone who lived by the principles of saving lives and doing the right thing. Surely the courts would see the truth. Surely justice would prevail. But as the trial progressed, it became painfully clear that things were not going in her favor. The courtroom buzzed with tension, the voices of the attorneys rising and falling as they argued their cases. Naomi sat silently, watching the bus driver across the room, his face a mask of indifference. He had shown no remorse, no regret for the violence he had inflicted upon her. In fact, he sat there as though this entire process was nothing more than an inconvenience. The prosecutor's voice echoed in Naomi's ears, though she could barely focus on the words. They had presented the facts, her injuries, the witnesses who had seen her lying on the ground, but none of it seemed to matter. Every time the defense attorney spoke, he twisted the narrative, making it seem as though Naomi had been the aggressor. He painted a picture of a woman who had lashed out, who had overreacted when she didn't get her way. And the worst part was that the lack of solid witness testimony made his version more convincing than it ever should have been. Naomi's stomach churned as the defense lawyer continued his story. "My client was simply doing his job, trying to maintain order on the bus," he said, his voice calm and smooth, as though he were discussing nothing more serious than a minor traffic infraction. He asked Miss Davis to take the next bus because of overcrowding, and she became hostile. She was aggressive, and when she tried to push past him, he acted in self-defense. Self-defense. The words made Naomi's skin crawl. She had been there, on the ground, her body bruised and bloodied from his assault, and yet here he was, claiming that she had somehow been the one to provoke him. She gritted her teeth, anger flaring inside her, but she forced herself to stay calm. There was no room for an emotional outburst, not here. She couldn't afford to give them any reason to see her as the angry black woman, the stereotype they were already trying to push onto her. Her lawyer, a competent but clearly overwhelmed public defender, stood and attempted to refute the claims, but Naomi could sense the hesitation in his voice. He had done his best to fight for her, but the odds were stacked against them. The defense had built their case on manipulation and lies, twisting the truth to fit their narrative, and the witnesses, who could have cleared Naomi's name, had either refused to testify or simply claimed they hadn't seen enough to be sure. Naomi glanced around the courtroom, searching for any of the faces from that day, the people who had stood by, watching as she was attacked. She had hoped they would come forward, that they would be brave enough to tell the truth, but none of them had. The seats reserved for witnesses remained empty, and Naomi's heart sank deeper with every passing minute. The judge, a stern-looking man with graying hair and cold eyes, sat behind the bench, his expression unreadable. Naomi had watched him throughout the trial, trying to gauge his thoughts, but he had remained stone-faced, giving nothing away. Now, as the defense attorney wrapped up his closing statement, the judge's eyes shifted to Naomi, and she felt the weight of his gaze like a physical pressure. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," the defense attorney said, his voice smooth and confident, "the evidence presented by the prosecution is circumstantial at best. There is no clear proof that my client acted with malicious intent. He was merely protecting himself from a violent outburst, and I ask you to consider the facts carefully before making your decision." Naomi's lawyer stood to give his final statement, but the energy in the room had already shifted. The jury, a group of faces that had remained impassive throughout the trial, seemed distant now, their expressions unreadable. Naomi could feel the tide turning against her, and the sense of impending defeat wrapped itself around her like a suffocating fog. As her lawyer spoke, Naomi's mind wandered back to the day of the attack. She could still feel the sting of the pavement against her skin, the sharp pain of the driver's fists and feet as they made contact with her body, the humiliation of being reduced to nothing in front of strangers, the knowledge that no one had lifted a finger to help. It all came rushing back in a wave of emotion. She had believed, for a moment, that justice would come, that the court would see through the lies, that the truth would prevail. But now, sitting here in this cold, impersonal courtroom, Naomi wasn't so sure. The truth didn't seem to matter. What mattered was the story the defense had crafted, a story that painted her as a threat, as someone who had overstepped her bounds. Her heart sank as the judge gave the jury their final instructions. The room seemed to blur around her, her mind racing as she tried to make sense of what was happening. It didn't seem real. How could this be happening? How could her truth be twisted and ignored so easily? The jury filed out of the room to begin their deliberations, and Naomi was left sitting in silence, her hands trembling in her lap. She wanted to scream, to shout at the injustice of it all, but she knew it wouldn't make a difference. The system wasn't built to hear her voice. It wasn't built to protect people like her. Time moved slowly as they waited for the jury to return. Each passing second felt like an eternity, and Naomi's chest tightened with anxiety. She tried to steady her breathing, to remain calm, but the fear of what was coming gnawed at her insides. Finally, the jury re-entered the room. Naomi's heart pounded as the foreman stood, holding the slip of paper that would seal her fate. Her lawyer shot her a brief, sympathetic glance, but Naomi could see the defeat in his eyes. He knew, just as she did, that the outcome had already been decided. The judge asked the foreman for the verdict, and the room fell deathly silent. Naomi held her breath, her hands gripping the edge of the table in front of her. "We, the jury, find the defendant not guilty on all charges," the foreman said, his voice flat and emotionless. The words hit Naomi like a physical blow. She sat frozen, unable to process what she had just heard. Not guilty. The driver, the man who had brutally attacked her in broad daylight, who had lied and twisted the truth to make her the villain, was walking free. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs, but Naomi couldn't hear them. Her mind was reeling, her body numb. She had lost. The system had failed her. The driver smirked from across the room, his victory complete, while Naomi sat there, broken and defeated. Her lawyer mumbled something about appeals, about trying again, but Naomi wasn't listening. None of it mattered. The truth didn't matter. She had been humiliated, brutalized, and now the man who had done it was free to go, with no consequences. As the court emptied, Naomi sat there alone, her heart heavy with the weight of injustice. The fight was over, and she had lost. Several months had passed since the trial, but the sting of injustice still lingered in Naomi's heart. Every day, she walked into the hospital with the weight of the court's verdict pressing down on her. She had tried to move on, to focus on her work, but the memories of that day, of the driver's cruel smirk and the coldness of the courtroom, haunted her. No matter how many lives she saved, no matter how many hours she poured into her patients, she couldn't shake the feeling that the world had failed her. On this particular afternoon, the hospital was busy, as usual. The emergency room buzzed with doctors and nurses moving swiftly between patients, the sounds of monitors beeping, and the low hum of voices creating a familiar background noise. Naomi had thrown herself into her work, more than ever, trying to distract herself from the gnawing sense of betrayal that still simmered inside her. But no matter how many people she helped, She couldn't escape the bitter taste of the past. As Naomi made her rounds, checking on her patients, her mind wandered back to the courtroom. The image of the bus driver, sitting smugly as he was declared not guilty, flashed in her mind. The humiliation, the anger, the helplessness, it all came rushing back, tightening her chest. She had lost faith in the justice system that day. She had lost faith in so much. Suddenly, the sound of commotion broke through her thoughts. A loud crash echoed from the entrance of the emergency room, followed by frantic shouting. Naomi turned, her attention snapping back to the present. Nurses and doctors rushed toward the doors as the automatic glass slid open, revealing a man sprinting inside, his face contorted in panic. In his arms was a small, limp figure, his daughter. "Help!" the man screamed, his voice cracking with desperation. "Someone help my daughter. She's not breathing." Naomi immediately dropped everything and rushed toward them. Her instincts as a doctor took over. She moved swiftly through the crowd of medical personnel, her eyes fixed on the child in the man's arms. But as she drew closer, her breath caught in her throat. It was him, the bus driver, the man who had attacked her, who had lied about her, who had walked free while she had been left to suffer the consequences of his violence. And now, here he was, standing in front of her, holding his unconscious daughter in his arms, pleading for help. Naomi froze for a split second, the shock of the moment hitting her like a wave. Her heart pounded in her chest as the memory of that terrible day surged back with full force. She could see his face so clearly, the hatred, the violence, the cold indifference as he left her, broken on the sidewalk. And now, here he was, desperate and helpless, begging for her to save his child. The man's eyes locked with hers, and for a moment they both stood frozen. Recognition flashed in his eyes, followed by something else. Fear, guilt, shame. His face twisted in a mixture of panic and remorse, his voice trembling as he spoke again. "Please," he choked out, his voice barely audible. "Please help her. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. But please, don't let my daughter die." Naomi's body tensed. Every instinct screamed at her to turn away and to let him feel the same helplessness she had felt on that day, to walk away and let him suffer. He had shown her no mercy, no humanity, and now he was begging her to save the most precious thing in his life. The irony was almost too much to bear. But then she looked down at the little girl in his arms, her small body pale and lifeless. Her chest barely moved, and her lips had taken on a bluish tint. She was on the brink of death. The anger and resentment that burned inside Naomi began to clash with the deep sense of duty that had driven her all these years. This child was innocent. She had nothing to do with her father's cruelty, nothing to do with the injustice Naomi had suffered. Naomi took a deep breath, steadying herself. She couldn't punish the child for the sins of her father. She was a doctor, and she had taken an oath to save lives, no matter whose they were. "Get her into the trauma room, now," Naomi ordered, her voice sharp and professional. The other nurses quickly took the girl from the man's arms and rushed her into the room. Naomi followed closely behind, her mind racing as she prepared herself for the battle to come. The father stood frozen for a moment, watching as they carried his daughter away before stumbling after them. He looked utterly broken, his earlier smugness replaced by the raw terror of a parent about to lose his child. Naomi could hear him mumbling to himself, whispering desperate apologies as he followed the medical team down the hallway. The trauma room was a blur of activity. Nurses worked quickly to hook the girl up to monitors, preparing the equipment for the procedure. Naomi's hands moved with practiced precision, her mind blocking out everything except the task at hand. She had to focus. The child's life was on the line, and she couldn't let her emotions get in the way. As they worked to stabilize the girl, the bus driver hovered near the door, his eyes wide with panic, his hands shaking uncontrollably. Naomi could feel his gaze on her, could feel the weight of his desperation, but she refused to look at him. This wasn't about him. It was about the girl. Minutes felt like hours as Naomi and her team worked to save the child. The girl's heart was weak, her breathing shallow, and every second counted. But Naomi's hands remained steady, her focus unwavering. She had done this hundreds of times before, and she would do it again, no matter who was watching. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, The girl's heart rate began to stabilize. The color slowly returned to her cheeks, and her breathing became more regular. Naomi let out a small sigh of relief, stepping back as the nurses finished the procedure. The girl was going to make it. She was going to live. Naomi wiped the sweat from her forehead, her body tense from the effort. She glanced at the little girl, now resting peacefully on the hospital bed, and felt a wave of quiet satisfaction. She had done her job. She had saved her. But as she turned to leave the room, she found herself face to face with the bus driver. He stood in the doorway, his face streaked with tears, his hands trembling at his sides. He looked like a man on the verge of collapse, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear, guilt, and overwhelming gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice hoarse and broken. "Thank you for saving her. I know I don't deserve it after what I did to you, but I'm begging you, please forgive me. I'm so sorry. I was wrong. I've been living with this guilt every day, and I don't know how to make it right." Naomi stared at him, her heart conflicted. This was the man who had attacked her, humiliated her, and left her to suffer. And now he was standing before her, begging for forgiveness, thanking her for saving his daughter's life. Part of her wanted to walk away, to leave him with his guilt, to let him suffer the same way she had. But another part of her, the part that had sworn to heal, to save lives no matter what, felt a pull of compassion. She took a deep breath, her eyes softening slightly as she looked at him. "I didn't do it for you," she said quietly, her voice steady but laced with pain. "I did it for her." The man nodded, tears streaming down his face as he dropped to his knees in front of her. I know. I can never make up for what I did to you, but please, I'm begging you, forgive me." Naomi stood there for a long moment, her emotions swirling inside her. Could she forgive him? Could she let go of the pain, the anger that had consumed her for so long? She wasn't sure, but in that moment she realized that forgiveness wasn't for him. It was for her. She had carried the weight of this injustice for too long, and it was time to let it go. "I forgive you," she said softly, the words hanging in the air between them. The man sobbed, his body shaking with relief, but Naomi didn't stay to watch. She turned and walked out of the room, her heart heavy but lighter at the same time. She had saved a life, and in doing so, she had taken the first step toward healing her own. Naomi stood in the hospital corridor, the cold fluorescent lights flickering overhead as the events of the past few hours settled into her mind. The weight of everything, the attack, the trial, the months of humiliation had been dragging her down for so long, and now, standing there after saving the bus driver's daughter, she felt something new, a quiet, fragile sense of peace. The hospital buzzed with its usual activity, nurses moving swiftly between rooms, doctors issuing instructions, the soft hum of machinery beeping in the background. But Naomi felt detached from it all. It was as if time had slowed down, giving her space to process the enormity of what had just happened. The man who had brutalized her, the one who had ruined her reputation, who had walked away from court with a smirk on his face, had been brought to his knees before her, not by her actions, but by his own guilt and fear for his daughter's life. The irony wasn't lost on Naomi. He had come to her, the very woman he had wronged, desperate for help, and she had saved his child, not out of pity for him, but because she couldn't bear to see an innocent life lost. As she leaned against the wall, the door to the trauma room swung open, and the bus driver stepped out. His face was a mask of exhaustion and relief. His hands still shook, but now they were at his sides, no longer clasped together in desperate pleading. His eyes met hers, filled with a deep sense of gratitude and shame. Naomi tensed for a moment. She didn't know what else he could possibly say, and she wasn't sure if she wanted to hear it. She had given him her forgiveness, but it hadn't come easily. It had taken everything in her to say those words, to let go of the anger she had carried for months. "Doctor," he began, his voice quiet, barely above a whisper, "I don't know how to thank you. What you did for my daughter, I can never repay you for that." Naomi stayed silent, her eyes steady on him. She had no interest in his gratitude. She hadn't done it for thanks or for redemption. She had done it because it was the right thing to do, because that little girl deserved a chance to live. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness," he continued, his voice breaking. "What I did to you was unforgivable. I was angry. I was wrong. and I took it out on you. I've been carrying that with me every day since it happened, and now, after today, after you saved her, I can't even look at myself." Naomi's heart softened, but only slightly. She had already decided to forgive him, but it wasn't something she could forget. The pain of that day, the injustice of the trial, the months of feeling powerless, they had all left scars, both physical and emotional. She couldn't simply erase that, but she also knew that holding on to the anger would only continue to hurt her. "I didn't do it for you," she repeated, her voice steady but firm. "I did it for your daughter. She didn't deserve to suffer because of your mistakes." The man nodded, tears filling his eyes again. He wiped them away quickly, but his hands trembled with the weight of his emotions. "I understand," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't expect you to ever forget what happened. I wouldn't either, but I promise you, I'm going to live the rest of my life trying to be better for her, for my daughter." Naomi felt a pang of sympathy for him, but it was muted by everything else. She had seen too much, been through too much, to believe that a simple apology could undo the damage he had caused. But his remorse was real, and maybe that was enough. Maybe it was a step in the right direction. "You need to teach her better," Naomi said quietly. "Teach her to see people for who they are, not for the color of their skin. Teach her to be better than you were that day." The man's eyes widened slightly, but he nodded again, his expression solemn. "I will," he whispered. "I promise." Naomi turned to leave, her mind swirling with thoughts and emotions she hadn't quite sorted through yet. The bus driver stood in the corridor, watching her go, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and gratitude. As she walked away, she knew she had done the right thing, but it didn't erase the pain of the past months. Forgiving him had been for her own peace, not for his. As she moved through the hospital hallways, heading toward the staff room, Naomi's thoughts drifted back to the months after the trial. The sense of betrayal she had carried with her had nearly consumed her. She had dedicated her life to saving others, yet no one had stepped forward to save her when she had needed it most. The system had failed her, and for so long, she had felt like she was drowning in the weight of that failure. But saving the bus driver's daughter had reminded her of something she had almost forgotten. Despite the cruelty, despite the injustice, she still had the power to make a difference. The system may have failed her, but she hadn't failed herself. She had done her job. She had saved a life. Inside the staff room, Naomi sat down at one of the tables, her body finally relaxing after the intensity of the day. She leaned back in her chair, letting out a long breath. The weight on her chest had lifted, but it hadn't disappeared entirely. It would take time. Forgiveness, she realized, wasn't about forgetting. It wasn't about pretending that everything was fine. It was about choosing to move forward, despite the pain. As she sat there, her phone buzzed in her pocket. Naomi pulled it out and glanced at the screen. A notification from the local news. The headline read, "Doctor saves life of child in critical condition. Father expresses deep gratitude." She sighed, her thumb hovering over the notification before she dismissed it. It was another story, another headline that people would forget in a few days. But for her, this wasn't just a story. It was her life. The scars left by that day with the bus driver would never fully fade, but she had taken the first step toward healing, and that, more than anything, was what mattered. Naomi stood up, her body still aching from the long shift, but her mind felt clearer. She grabbed her coat and made her way toward the exit. As she pushed open the door and stepped into the cool evening air, she breathed deeply, the fresh air filling her lungs. She had made it through. She had survived, and now she was ready to move forward. Thank you for watching this powerful story of injustice and redemption. If this video moved you, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and give it a thumbs up. Your support means the world to me and helps me create more impactful stories like this one. Share your thoughts in the comments. How would you have reacted in Naomi's situation? And don't miss out on more eye-opening content by checking out my other videos. Together, we can raise awareness and spark change.